I want to begin quietly because at 97 years old, I've learned that the most important things are rarely introduced with noise. Noise is for selling. What I'm sharing with you comes from a different place. It comes from watching real lives unfold over many decades, including my own, and finally accepting what the evidence has been trying to say all along. My name is Robert Langford. I spent more than 55 years studying nutrition and human health in the United States, teaching at a public university, training graduate students, and reading the medical journals long before they were summarized into headlines. I've lived long enough to see ideas become popular, disappear, and then quietly return once the excitement wore off and the data remained. At this age, I don't speak in certainties. Aging humbles you, but I do speak in patterns, because patterns are what remain when opinions fade. When I was younger, I believed that growing old happened suddenly. You were fine, and then one day you weren't. That belief is comforting when you're young, because it allows you to ignore small choices. But nothing about aging is sudden. It is slow, cumulative, and very honest. It keeps a careful record of what you do day after day. I saw this clearly in my early 40s. I was teaching full-time, publishing research, raising a family, and telling myself I was too busy to worry about my own habits. I ate quickly, I sat too much. I treated stress like a badge of importance. On paper, I was successful. In my body, I was headed in the wrong direction. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly, through lab results and fatigue and a doctor who spoke more plainly than I liked. That was my turning point. Not because I was afraid of dying tomorrow, but because I didn't want to spend the last 20 years of my life shrinking. The first thing I changed was movement, not exercise, but movement. I stopped thinking in terms of workouts and started thinking in terms of use. Bodies are meant to be used regularly, not intensely. Walking, carrying groceries, standing up often, moving through the day instead of sitting inside it. One of the most physically capable men I ever knew was a janitor named Frank at the university where I taught. Frank was in his late 70s, pushed a heavy cart all day, climbed stairs without complaint, and never once talked about fitness. When I asked him how he stayed so capable, he looked at me like I'd asked a strange question and said, "I don't stop." That answer stayed with me. Years later, when I read large population studies showing that even modest daily activity is associated with lower mortality risk in older adults, it felt less like a discovery and more like confirmation. Movement keeps systems awake that quietly shut down when neglected. Balance, circulation, strength, confidence. I still walk most mornings, slowly now, carefully, but consistently. Movement doesn't make you young again. It keeps you functional long enough to enjoy being old. Food came next, and this was harder emotionally. I grew up eating like most Americans of my generation. Large portions, meat at the center, vegetables as decoration. That was normal. It was also expensive for the body over time. What changed my thinking wasn't ideology, but repetition. Across cultures, across decades, people who lived the longest tended to eat mostly plants. Not perfectly, not rigidly, just mostly. Beans, vegetables, whole grains, fruit. When animal foods appeared, they were smaller and less frequent. I had a patient named Harold from Chicago, a retired warehouse supervisor in his early 60s. He came to see me after his cardiologist told him his numbers were heading the wrong way. Harold didn't want a miracle. He wanted something he could live with. We didn't overhaul his life. We started with walking after dinner and shifting his meals so plants took up more space than meat. That was it. 10 years later, Harold wrote me a letter, a real one with ink on paper. He told me he was hiking with his grandchildren in Indiana Dunes State Park and that he felt useful again. That word mattered. He didn't credit me with saving his life. He said the changes felt doable, and because they were doable, he stayed with them. That's how real change works. Another habit that consistently appeared in long-lived populations was stopping before fullness. In the United States, we often equate fullness with satisfaction. But biologically, fullness is excess. Many cultures that age well stop eating when they are comfortably fed, not stuffed. This creates space for repair instead of constant processing. I learned to slow down. I learned to recognize the moment when I no longer needed more food, even if I still wanted it. That small restraint, practiced thousands of times, turned out to be powerful. Sugar was a more difficult lesson, not because the science was unclear, but because sugar had become normal. It was everywhere. Breakfast, snacks, drinks, even foods marketed as healthy. In 2014, research published in JAMA Internal Medicine examined U.S. adults and found that higher intake of added sugars was associated with increased risk of death from cardiovascular disease, particularly among those consuming the highest amounts. This wasn't a fringe study. It came from one of the most respected medical journals in the country, and it confirmed what many clinicians were seeing in practice. I worked with a woman named Eileen from Dayton, Ohio, in her early 70s. She proudly told me she never drank soda, but her day was still filled with sweetened cereal, flavored yogurt, coffee drinks, and snack bars. We didn't eliminate sweetness from her life. We made it occasional instead of constant. A few months later, she told me something simple but important. She no longer felt shaky or exhausted in the afternoons. When older adults stabilize energy, everything else becomes easier. Movement, sleep, patience, decision-making. Alcohol followed a similar pattern in my own life. When I was younger, moderate drinking was widely promoted as harmless, even beneficial. As larger studies emerged, the picture grew more complicated. For many people, especially as they age, less alcohol means better sleep, clearer thinking, and fewer cumulative risks. I stepped away from it decades ago and never felt deprived. Tobacco, however, has no ambiguity. I've seen too much data and too many shortened lives. If you smoke, quitting is one of the most meaningful steps you can take for your health. Nothing else I've said carries that level of impact. As I aged, my attention shifted beyond biology towards something medicine often underestimates. In 2010, a large meta-analysis published in PLOS Medicine examined data from over 300,000 participants and found that stronger social relationships were associated with significantly greater survival. That finding stayed with me because it reframed loneliness not as a feeling, but as a health risk. I understood this personally after my wife passed away. The house grew quiet in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had discipline. I had routines. But loneliness is not solved by productivity. It is solved by people. I became intentional about staying connected. Meals with family, phone calls, conversations with former students, neighbors stopping by. These weren't distractions. They were protective. Purpose works the same way. It doesn't have to be grand. It simply has to exist. Research using the midlife in the United States study showed that people who reported a stronger sense of purpose tended to have lower mortality risk over time. Purpose pulls people back into life. I remember a retired school bus driver named Walter from rural Pennsylvania. After retirement, his days collapsed into television and silence. His daughter asked him to watch his grandchildren 2 afternoons a week. That simple responsibility changed everything. He walked more because he wanted to keep up. He ate better because he didn't want to feel tired. Purpose didn't push him, it pulled him. Sleep became another lesson I learned late but took seriously. Sleep is not passive rest, it is active repair. When sleep rhythm deteriorates, appetite, mood, and resilience often follow. I learned to protect routine over perfection. Consistent bedtime, morning light, less stimulation late at night. These habits support systems we rarely notice until they fail. And finally, stress. Not stress as an occasional visitor, that's life. I'm talking about chronic urgency. The feeling that you're always behind, always tense. Long-lived people are not stress-free. They are stress-recovering. They build calm into their days. Walks, prayer, naps, laughter, slow meals, quiet moments. That recovery is not weakness, it is wisdom. If you've stayed with me this long, I'd like you to try something simple. Choose one habit, just one. Practice it for 7 days. Not angrily, not perfectly, just attentively. Then notice what changes, not just in your body, but in your mood, your sleep, your patience. If you're thinking, I've already lived most of my life, listen carefully. You don't need a second lifetime to benefit from better habits. You need a faithful next month, then another. I am 97 years old. I don't think about living forever. I think about living well until the end, keeping my legs, keeping my mind, keeping my dignity. These rules are not exciting. They are effective, and effectiveness is what matters when you want to reach old age without losing yourself along the way. You still have time. That is the most important truth I can leave you with.